Tae-ho enters the room, a silhouette against the storm. Outside, rain streaks against the massive glass windows, blurring the glowing city skyline into a cold, blue-tinted mosaic. Tae-ho, a sharply dressed Mafia strategist, leans invasively over the glossy black table. His posture is assertive, his jaw tense, and his eyes are locked with a predatory, terrifying stillness on the woman standing before him. Evelyn Carter, a waitress in a sleek black dress, standing upright and unreadable. She holds a silver tray between them like a barrier, her gaze steady and unflinching despite the suffocating tension hanging in the air. But she doesn't know what lies beneath his stare. For 10 years, Tae-ho has lived in a grayscale of nothingness. He is a machine built of flesh and bone, functioning perfectly while completely broken inside. He has taken bullets without flinching and watched acts of violence without a single flutter of his pulse. To him, a glass of expensive whiskey tastes like water. He is a man starving to death in a banquet hall, a ghost haunting a tomb of his own making. Until the silence is broken by a sudden, deafening crash. Evelyn's legs, weak from the double shifts worked to pay her mother's hospital bills, finally betray her. She pitches forward, and the silver tray clatters to the floor, crystals shattering like diamonds against the hardwood. Tae-ho moves with terrifying speed to catch her arm, and the moment their skin connects, the ice doesn't just crack, it shatters. A jolt of electricity violently restarts his nervous system, a searing heat racing up his arm and exploding in his chest. Looking into her wide, terrified eyes, Tae-ho realizes he has found a physiological anomaly he cannot let go. I want your presence, I want your proximity, and I will pay whatever it takes to keep this fire burning. Before we step further into the cold world of Tae-ho and find out if Evelyn survives the Devil's Lair, I want to pause and thank you for being here. This story is about finding heat in the darkness, and I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from today. Drop your location in the comments. It helps remind me that even in the digital void, we aren't alone. Evelyn Carter's world was a relentless cycle of bleach and fluorescent lights. By day, she moved through the sterile corridors of the cardiac wing, her heart sinking with every rhythmic beep of the monitor that kept her mother, Linda, anchored to this world. By night, she wore the mask of a poised waitress, navigating the shadows of the city's elite. Her hope was a gray, lukewarm thing, squeezed tight like the damp rag in her apron pocket. Each vibration of her phone was a jagged threat, another notification from the hospital, another overdue notice for medication that cost more than she earned in a month. Her mother's failing heart was a ticking clock, its deafening countdown driving Evelyn to work double shifts in the Devil's Lair just to keep the silence at bay. The penthouse of the Skyview high-rise was a cathedral of glass and steel, a place where the air felt thin and the moral temperature was always sub-zero. To the men who moved through these shadowed halls, Evelyn was less than a ghost. She was a utility as unnoticed as the light switches. Invisibility had always been her armor, a way to survive the predatory gazes of those who traded in blood and influence. She stayed in the periphery, eyes down, serving crystal tumblers of amber liquid to men who saw the world as a game of conquest. But tonight, the weight of the silver tray felt like a leaden anchor. Her legs, hollowed out by exhaustion and the meager scraps she called meals, began to tremble. She watched the rain lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights below looking like drowned jewels. The digital screen on the mahogany desk flickered with numbers that represented more wealth than she could fathom, yet she was drowning for the sake of a few $1,000s.
She stepped forward to clear a glass, but the thick pile of the Persian rug caught the heel of her sensible shoe. Gravity claimed her with a cruel suddenness. As she pitched forward, a gasp escaped her lips, the silver tray slipping from her numb fingers. She braced for the impact, for the cold dismissal that would surely follow, and for the final loss of the job that kept her mother alive. Instead, she felt the world stop. An iron-hard grip clamped around her arm, not to crush her, but to catch her. The contact was a violent spark in the dark, and as she looked up into the black void eyes of Tae-ho, the silent enigma of her life was finally, terrifyingly broken.
The heavy mahogany doors swung shut with a finality that made the air in the penthouse feel even thinner. Evelyn sat in the leather chair opposite the massive ebony desk, her hands buried in her lap to hide the tremors she couldn't suppress. Across from her, Tae-ho didn't look like a man. He looked like a statue carved from obsidian, bathed in the cold, gray light of the rising sun. The silence between them was thick, a chasm of glass and steel that felt impossible to cross. Tae-ho broke the quiet not with a reprimand, but with a clinical recitation of her life. He spoke of stage 4 congestive heart failure and the transplant list her mother had occupied for 8 months. He spoke of her 60-hour work weeks and the sheer suffocating weight of the debt that was threatening to discharge Linda to hospice care by Friday. Every word was a blow, stripping away Evelyn's carefully constructed armor until she felt raw and exposed in the center of his devil's lair. "How do you know that?" she whispered, the horror washing over her like ice water. "I know everything," he replied simply, sliding a sleek black folder across the polished surface of the desk. He didn't look up, his jaw set in a tension that hadn't been there before the crash. He wasn't firing her, he was promoting her. He stood and walked around the desk, stopping inches from her chair. He didn't touch her, but the air between them seemed to vibrate with a phantom heat. He spoke of a physiological anomaly, of the moment her skin had brushed his and the world had surged back into his deadened nerves. He wasn't buying her body, he was buying her presence. He was offering a miracle wrapped in a cage. $10 million to cover every surgery, every medication, and every breath her mother had left to take. "I don't want a nurse, and I don't want a maid," he rasped, his voice dropping to a low, rough timbre that sent a shiver down her spine. "I want you available 24 hours a day. I intend to study the fire you've started, and I intend to use it." Evelyn looked at the contract, then at the man who terrified her. He was offering her the world at the cost of her freedom. Thinking of her mother's tired smile and the ticking clock in the hospital room, she picked up the pen. The deal was struck, and the grayscale of her life was suddenly, violently colored by a $10 million proximity. The transition from the servants' quarters to the master suite was a journey of only 2 floors, but for Evelyn it felt like crossing into a different galaxy. She stood in the center of the cavernous room, clutching the frayed strap of her duffel bag, her entire life packed into a canvas that had seen better decades. The space was a temple of glass, steel, and cold marble, a masterpiece of architecture that overlooked the city skyline but felt utterly suffocating. It was beautiful, breathless, and silent, a reflection of the man who owned it. As she walked toward the walk-in closet, her scuffed sneakers squeaked rhythmically against the polished floor. Inside, her Bray maid uniforms had been replaced by rows of silk, cashmere, and velvet, dresses that cost more than her mother's car, and shoes with heels sharp enough to draw blood. It wasn't a wardrobe, it was a costume department for a role she didn't know how to play. She placed her bag on a velvet ottoman where it looked like a bruise on perfect skin. When she reached out to touch a pearl-colored silk robe, her fingers trembled with the realization that she was no longer a person, but a high-priced asset. "Don't get too comfortable." The voice was smooth, low, and laced with razor blades. Evelyn spun around to find Min Jae, Tae-ho's second-in-command, leaning against the doorframe. Where Tae-ho was a frozen void, Min Jae was a coiled viper, his eyes sharp and burning with a clinical distaste. He moved into the room with deliberate slowness, invading her personal space and dissecting her from her messy curls to her worn shoes. "The boss thinks you are a miracle," Min Jae whispered, his gaze stopping directly in front of her. "He thinks you are the cure to a 10-year curse, but I know what you are." He reached out, picking up a lock of her hair between his fingers. He warned her that Tae-ho's numbness was what kept him sharp and alive in a world of wolves. If she made him soft or distracted him, her mother's heart wouldn't be her only concern. "Play your part, Miss Carter," he said, his smile failing to reach his cold eyes. "But do not think for a second that this cage protects you from me." He turned on his heel, leaving Evelyn alone in the golden light, shivering in the finest room. The golden light of the penthouse felt like an interrogation lamp as Min Jae stepped deeper into the suite, his presence radiating a menacing heat. Evelyn stood her ground, though her spine felt like it might snap under the weight of his clinical dissection. He loomed over her, a man who had clearly buried the bodies of everyone who had ever dared to cross his path, and his smile was a jagged thing that never reached his eyes. "You think because he felt a spark, you own the fire?" Min Jae's voice was a whisper that carried across the cavernous room like a serrated blade. He reached out, his hand moving not with affection, but with a clinical distaste as he caught a lock of her hair between his fingers. He reminded her that for a decade, Tae-ho had been untouchable, his numbness a suit of armor that kept him sharp while the wolves were at the door. Evelyn swallowed hard, the scent of expensive leather and cold rain clinging to the air around them. "I am just trying to save my mother," she managed, her voice steadier than the frantic thrum of her pulse. Min Jae didn't flinch. He let her hair fall as if it were contaminated. He warned her that if her presence distracted Tae-ho, if she made the Ice King soft in a world that demanded stone, the consequences would be lethal. He wasn't just talking about her contract, he was talking about her life. "Play your part. Be the cure," he commanded, stepping back to look her in the eye with a gaze that promised violence. "But do not think for a second that this cage protects you from me. If you hurt him, I will finish what the poison started." He turned on his heel and vanished into the silent corridor, leaving Evelyn alone in the center of her $10 million prison, shivering despite the warmth of the room. Therapy was a sterile word for the quiet desperation that unfolded in the penthouse living room that night. They sat on the expansive velvet sofa, the city of Seoul glowing like a circuit board beneath them, separated by a cushion of fabric and a chasm of silence. Tae-ho reached out, his movements hesitant, like a man reaching into a fire, afraid of the burn yet craving the heat. When he took Evelyn's hand, his palm was rough, his fingers engulfing hers without a squeeze. He held on as if she were the only solid thing in a world of smoke, his breathing slowly sinking into rhythm with hers as he drew sensation from her pulse. "It tingles," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. To him, it felt like waking up a limb that had been asleep for a decade, a sensation that was agonizingly perfect. Later, the staff brought dinner, a spread of intricate dishes that usually tasted like ash to his deadened palate. Tonight, Tae-ho dismissed the servers with a sharp wave of his hand. He didn't want the performance of dining. He wanted the intimacy of it. They ate in a silence that was no longer terrifying, but companionable. Evelyn watched him over the rim of her glass, noticing the slight tremor in his hands, a side effect of the sensory overload. In that moment, the terrifying Mafia strategist vanished, replaced by a man who had been denied the simplest pleasures of existence for 10 long years. He looked frustrated, a furrow appearing between his brows as he struggled with the intensity of the experience. "Is it better?" she asked softly, gesturing toward the spicy stew. Tae-ho looked up, surprised that she cared, or perhaps surprised that he was no longer alone in his sensory deprivation tank. He took a bite, his eyes locking onto hers as a flicker of something raw and unfiltered passed over his face. "I can taste the heat," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The spice seared through his nerve endings, racing up his throat and exploding in his chest. It was violent and overwhelming, yet he welcomed the sting because it told him he was finally, truly alive. Evelyn didn't move, realizing in that shared moment that she wasn't just a battery charging a machine. She was the only flame in his endless winter, and terrifyingly, she wanted to keep burning for him. The drive to the outskirts of the city was silent, the armored sedan winding through hills covered in mist. Chairman Beck's estate was a fortress disguised as a sanctuary, surrounded by high stone walls and ancient pines that seemed to whisper of old secrets and forgotten violence. When they stepped out, the air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, a sharp contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled luxury of the penthouse. Tae-ho kept a hand on the small of Evelyn's back, a touch that felt possessive and grounding. For the first time, Evelyn realized he wasn't just guiding her, he was drawing strength from her, using her presence to steady his newly awakened nerves. Chairman Beck awaited them in a traditional tea room, kneeling by a low table with the stillness of a predator waiting in tall grass. He was an old man with a face mapped by deep lines and scars, but his eyes were sharp, unclouded by age or mercy. He watched them enter, his gaze lingering on the way Tae-ho moved, no longer a machine of precise mechanical indifference, but a man with a pulse. "You look different, Tae-ho," Beck said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. He didn't look at Evelyn yet. The stone has finally cracked. When Beck finally turned his gaze toward her, it wasn't a welcome, it was an autopsy. He dissected her fear, her posture, and the way her hand instinctively sought Tae-ho's for comfort. He poured tea with steady hands, the steam rising between them like a veil. "To feel is a gift for a common man," Beck murmured, sliding a cup toward them. "But for a king, it is a liability." He leaned forward, the grandfatherly mask slipping to reveal the ruthless warlord beneath. He reminded Tae-ho that when he was ice, he was invincible, a ghost with no heart to stab and no fear to exploit. But now Tae-ho was leaning toward her, checking her breath and carrying a terror he had never known. "I am stronger," Tae-ho insisted, though his grip on Evelyn's hand tightened painfully. "I have something to fight for." "You have something to lose," Beck corrected sharply, his eyes filled with a grim pity. "In our world, that is the same as having a gun pressed to your temple." He looked at Evelyn, his expression darkening with a final haunting warning. "You have made him human again, child, and softness gets men killed." The sterile beep of the heart monitor was the most beautiful music Evelyn had ever heard. Linda was sleeping, her chest rising and falling with a robust rhythm that her failing heart had never managed before the surgery. Squeezing her mother's hand, Evelyn whispered a silent prayer of gratitude to the dangerous man who had made this miracle possible. For a fleeting moment, the golden cage of her contract felt worth every sacrifice. Needing to hear his voice, needing to tell him that the cure was working in more ways than one, Evelyn stepped out into the hospital corridor to call Tae-ho. But the hallway of the cardiac wing was quiet, too quiet. The two stone-faced guards Min Jae had assigned to the door were gone, and a prickle of unease danced down her spine. She turned to retreat into her mother's room, but the air shifted. A shadow detached itself from the alcove near the nurse's station. Before she could scream, a heavy hand clamped over her mouth, tasting of leather and chemicals. She kicked out, her heel connecting with a shin, but the arm around her waist was like a steel band. She was lifted off her feet and dragged backward into a service elevator that stood waiting with its doors open. As the world blurred into a dark chemical haze, the last thing she saw was the scuffed floor tile where her guard's phone lay, cracked, silent, and abandoned. Across the city, in the high-rise office that felt more like a fortress, Tae-ho was staring at his phone. She should have called by now. The silence was itching under his skin, a phantom rash he couldn't scratch. When his phone finally buzzed, he snatched it up, expecting her soft voice. Instead, a video file opened. The screen flickered to life. The setting was dark and industrial, and there, tied to a rusted chair, was Evelyn. Her lip was split, a bloom of red against her skin, and her eyes were wide with a terror that punched through the screen and slammed directly into Tae-ho's chest. For 10 years he had felt nothing, but now a tsunami of sensation crashed into him, a cold, acidic fear that made his hands shake and his vision swim. The phone cracked in his grip as his heart hammered against his ribs with the frantic, agonizing rhythm of panic. They had taken his oxygen, and now he was going to make sure everyone else suffocated. The warehouse doors didn't just open, they disintegrated as Tae-ho's armored SUV rammed through them, metal screeching against concrete like a dying beast. He stepped out of the wreckage before the engine had even died, his gun raised and his silhouette cut from a haze of smoke and shadows. For a decade, Tae-ho had fought with the detached efficiency of a surgeon, but tonight he fought like a butcher. Bullets sparked against the stone pillars beside his head, the sound a deafening physical blow to his newly awakened eardrums. A shard of concrete sliced his cheek, and he welcomed the hot, sharp sting of it. The pain was fuel for the roaring inferno in his chest that screamed only one name, Evelyn. He moved through the crossfire with terrifying speed, refusing to take cover as he advanced like a force of nature. When a guard lunged at him, Tae-ho didn't just disarm the man, he broke his arm with a sickening crack that vibrated up his own bones. He felt the resistance of cartilage and the warmth of the blood that splattered across his pristine white shirt, a chaotic symphony of violence that he conducted with brutal sensory precision. He found the room at the back just as the man from the video stood over Evelyn with a knife in his hand. Tae-ho didn't hesitate. He fired once, and the man dropped instantly. Silence rushed back into the room, heavier than the gunfire had been. Evelyn sat tied to the chair, her face bruised and her eyes squeezed shut as she flinched away from the carnage. Tae-ho's gun clattered to the floor as he crossed the distance in 2 strides, falling to his knees before her. His hands, slick with the blood of the men who had dared to take her, hovered over her face, trembling uncontrollably. He cut the ropes with frantic, desperate movements, and the moment her hands were free and she reached for him, the contact hit him like a physical blow. Her skin was warm. She was alive. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her neck as the adrenaline that had sustained him crashed, leaving him raw and exposed. A jagged sob tore from his throat, shaking his entire frame as he clutched her, terrified that she would vanish like smoke if he let go. "I felt it," he choked out, tears mixing with the blood on his face. "I felt the fear. I felt the rage. I thought I lost you." On that dirty warehouse floor, the mighty strategist was reduced to a trembling man, undone by the beautiful agony of finally being alive. The sting of the antiseptic was sharp, a biting heat against the gash on his cheekbone, but Tae-ho didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his eyes and leaned into Evelyn's touch, savoring the sensation as if every throb of pain were a victory, a testament that the ice had not returned. They sat on the edge of the bed in the master suite, the blood washed away, but the emotional bruises remained tender. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she applied the bandage, her eyes dark with the memory of the warehouse. "I'm hurting you," she whispered, pulling her hand back. Tae-ho caught her wrist, pressing her palm firmly against his bandaged face. "No," he rasped, his voice thick with a raw, terrifying honesty. "You are healing me. The pain tells me I am here. It tells me I am alive." He reached into the pocket of his torn trousers and pulled out the folded piece of paper that had defined their lives for the last month, the $10 million contract. With deliberate slowness, he tore it in half, then in half again, letting the white fragments flutter to the floor like snow. Panic flared in Evelyn's eyes, her breath hitching as she watched her security disintegrate. "The deal is over, Evelyn," he said. "You're sending me away?" she whispered, her voice brittle. "I am freeing you," he corrected, pulling her between his knees so he could look up at her, his dark eyes shining with an intensity that burned. "I don't want a nurse. I don't want a cure. I don't want a contract that forces you to be near me. I love you, Evelyn. Stay because you choose to, or leave because you must, but do not stay for the money." Evelyn stared at him, seeing the monster who had slaughtered men for her, and the man who was terrified of losing her. The Ice King was gone, replaced by someone who finally felt everything. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, her choice made before he had even finished the sentence. "I choose you, Tae-ho," she whispered. "I choose the fire." 18 months later, the silence of the penthouse was broken not by the lonely ticking of a clock, but by a soft, gurgling cry. Tae-ho stood by the window, the morning sun bathing him in gold as he looked down at his daughter. As Evelyn wrapped her arms around his waist, asking what he felt, he kissed the top of the child's head. "Everything," he promised. "I feel everything. Thank you for staying through the frost and the fire until the very last word. Knowing you're out there means everything to me. If Tae-ho and Evelyn's journey moved you, please subscribe and leave a like. It's how we keep the lights on in this corner of the city. I read every comment, because for me, the real story happens in the connection we share after the screen goes dark. Don't go too far. The next shadow is already beginning to move. I'll see you in the next story."